Welcome to part 3 of my video on how to tweak the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons to replicate a game of the Elder Scrolls. In this video, I'll go over the last few topics I wanted to cover about the Elder Scrolls campaign that I ran myself, and give you some advice and pitfalls to watch out for if you want to try running a game of TES D&D yourself. If you haven't seen parts 1 or 2, links to those will be down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when I come out with more stuff. This is another area where it's easy for a DM to get bogged down. There's so many fantastical creatures in the Elder Scrolls series, and if you're like me, you're going to want to throw in as many of them as possible, both to provide challenges to your players and also to flesh out parts of the lore that don't really get brought up much in the actual games. Like Dwarven Spectres. Seriously, what's the deal with them? Why are they only in Morrowind? To my knowledge, nobody in the game even mentions them directly, even in lore books. You'd think Yagram Bagarn or Arniel Gain would have at least made a passing reference to these Dwemer ghosts that are apparently capable of speaking and holding conversations with you. Why weren't they in Skyrim? Can only the Nerevarines see them? Was it proximity to the heart of Lorkhan? Or a product of Dagoth Ur's work with the Akulakan that allowed them to manifest? Were there Dwemer ghosts in Skyrim but the Falmer killed them all? Somebody should get Fudge Muppet or Camelworks on this. Anyway, before you go and create an entire bestiary for your game, try and take a step back and consider what you already have to work with. In the Elder Scrolls, just like in D&D, most monsters can basically be reduced to a hit point value and a suite of abilities and special traits. If you scan through the 5e Monster Manual, or any of the myriad of other creature compendiums that have been released for 5th edition, you'll find plenty of familiar faces. Centaurs, goblins, orcs, minotaurs, griffins, medusas, wraiths, and so on. A troll in the Elder Scrolls series might be a three-eyed gorilla rather than a warty green giant, but mechanically the basics are the same. You can just bump them down to medium size, reduce their hit points to compensate, rename their bite attack to something like Hammer Fist, and there you go. The same can be done with a bunch of monsters. Shrink a fire elemental down to medium size and give it the Firebolt cantrip, and you have a Flame Atronak. If you want to mimic the version found in Skyrim, give it the Death Burst ability. If you'd rather have a Daggerfall Fire Daedra, give it a Longsword and Half Plate. What I usually do is figure out what kind of creature I want to include in a dungeon. Let's say a cave with a bunch of Daedra worshippers. Now, for the cultists themselves, I can just use the stat blocks from the Monster Manual or Volo's Guide. If I want to add some variety, I'll decide what race each cultist is and add 1 or 2 traits or racial powers to the basic block. So I might give a Breton magic resistance or an Argonian the amphibious trait and a swim speed. An orc might get the reckless trait while an Nord would get cold resistance, etc. The trick here is to keep things simple. Generally speaking, you don't want to give an NPC all of the traits a player race gets. Save this treatment for bosses or other NPCs that you want to be a memorable or special challenge. Also, don't forget that monsters and PCs don't have to use the same rules in 5e. You can always make monster abilities simpler or remove some of the limitations that would make a power unbalanced in the hands of a player. I'd say that most of the monsters in the Elder Scrolls series has an appropriate analog in D&D, though not necessarily with the same name. But let's say you think a monster is too unique to just cut and paste. For example, there's no Ice Elemental in 5th edition, so how would you go about making a Frost Atronak? Well, a Frost Atronak is big and powerful, but pretty dumb, so something like an Ogre or maybe a Frost Giant would be a good base. Once you have that, you start adding or replacing traits and abilities. If I'm going specifically for the Frost Atronak from Oblivion, for instance, I change its creature type to Elemental, give it immunity to cold and poison, and the poison condition, and give it the traits Regeneration and Damage Reflection. For its actions, I give it Freezing Touch and Frostbolt. Usually, I don't bother calculating CR since I use Milestone XP anyway, but if you want to make sure you haven't created a TPK machine, you can go ahead and run the numbers. One thing that will make this easier is if you develop a standard for how mechanics like Spell Reflection or vulnerabilities will work. Since in most Elder Scrolls games, there's a limited selection of special abilities that all of the monsters in the game draw from. It's the specific assortment of abilities that each monster has that differentiates them from all the others. Also, there are some cases where a direct translation of mechanics might be kind of weird or boring, and so might require a bit of tweaking. For example, in Oblivion again, pretty much all Daedra except for Storm Atronachs have a weakness to shock damage. This doesn't really make sense until you realize that shock damage in the Elder Scrolls series includes what D&D would consider radiant damage or holy damage. Now, you could easily just give every Daedra vulnerability to radiant damage and call it a day. However, one of the design philosophies of 5th edition thus far has been to use vulnerabilities to damage pretty sparingly, and only in cases where it would really make sense. So instead you can give Daedra sunlight sensitivity, or make them frightened for a turn when they take radiant damage, or something else that's thematically appropriate, but has more of an interesting tactical effect on gameplay besides I just deal more damage. Another thing I'd like to point out is that you shouldn't feel limited to the monsters that appear in the TES games. Part of the fun of being a DM is flipping through a monster book and going, oh wow, that thing's awesome. I wonder if I can kill my players with it. One of the cool things about setting a game in Tamriel is that there's so much cool stuff in the lore that has never really been shown in any of the games, like flying whales, or fox people, or the entire continent of Akvir, or weresharks. Especially if your players aren't as well versed in the minutiae of the setting as you are, it's perfectly fine to throw in creatures from vanilla D&D that feel like they belong in Tamriel. For example, the Elder Scrolls games have griffins, medusas, minotaurs, and harpies, so why not satyrs, gorgons, basilisks, or hydras? Something like an ankeg doesn't seem out of place in Morrowind, nor would a bullet in the swamps of Blackmarsh. What's especially useful is if you don't necessarily call the creatures by name when you have them attack the party, just describe what they look like and leave the rest ambiguous. Veteran players might know what you're talking about, but for newer players, they wouldn't really have any reason to believe that these creatures aren't being pulled from Elder Scrolls lore like the rest of your monsters. This is simultaneously the easiest and most challenging part of building an Elder Scrolls campaign. On the one hand, as I said in the intro, the world of Tamriel comes pre-packaged with so much detail that most of the background work of setting up a campaign is already done for you. You have pre-existing continents, nations, an extensive historical record, a cosmology with a conveniently vague and mythologized origin story, and multiple pantheons of gods for you to choose from. If you set your campaign in a time period and location that's been covered in the TES series, you can even take the names of NPCs, businesses, nobles, and so forth right from the video games set in that part of the timeline. One thing that is extremely useful in this regard is the UESP Wiki's extensive list of names for NPCs. In Arena and Daggerfall, character names were randomly generated by taking a prefix and a suffix and mixing them together. Since my campaign was set during this time, I found it appropriate, not to mention easy, to do the same thing. You can either devise a table to do this randomly, or just pick one of the names that sounds right to you. Another method I used for some NPCs was to take a given name from one game's list and then choose a random surname from a different game for someone of the same race. Or a different race, maybe, whatever you think suits your campaign. Now, the challenging part comes when managing your players' base assumptions and metagame knowledge, especially if you decide to diverge from the world as it's presented in the video games. See, a lot of what players take for granted in a video game doesn't really make sense in a tabletop RPG. In a game of D&D, you can't just go around murdering the populace of an entire town, then just pay a fine and go about your business as if nothing happened. In D&D, even a small city is supposed to have thousands of people in it. The capital city of the Empire of Cyrodiil in TES 4 has like 150 people in it, maybe as many as 250 if you include the nameless respawning guards that patrol the streets. In D&D, you can't just rock up to the local noble's house, rifle through their personal belongings, dance around on their dining table, and then just walk up to their throne and demand a quest. There's etiquette, there's procedure, there are trained guards who aren't going to let a heavily armed mercenary band get within stabbing distance of their ruler, etc. What I tried to do in my campaign was convey the sense of scale and vibrance that these places would actually have in real life. The Cloud District of Whiterun is not just a single building at the top of a couple flights of stairs. It's an entire hillside neighborhood full of magnificent chateaus and opulent manors owned and occupied by the most influential nobles and wealthiest merchants. The Arcane University in the Imperial City shouldn't be a single tower surrounded by a handful of little rooms containing like a dozen people or so. It should be a sprawling campus with hundreds of faculty and thousands of students from across the Empire. Ironically, the games with the most realistic settlements were the earliest ones. Of course, that's mostly because they were procedurally generated, and it's not hard to render hundreds of buildings at one time when they're all just a box with a 10-pixel tiled texture on it. This isn't to say you have to rebuild Tamriel from the ground up. Diverging from the world that players are familiar with can make for a more immersive game, but it also risks alienating those players that prefer the way things work in the video games. There's really no right answer here. It heavily depends on the needs of your campaign and where you place it in the setting and timeline of the TES series. Most of Tamriel hasn't been covered in an Elder Scrolls game other than ESO, which some people don't consider to be canon since it's technically not made by Bethesda. If you're not including stuff from ESO, then you're free to portray most of the continent outside of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, the island of Vardenfell, and the Iliac Bay region pretty much however you want. This can be a double-edged sword, of course. The less information there is on a certain time or place in Tamriel, the more you have to come up with on your own. So it's partly a balance between how much freedom you want to build the story you want to tell versus how much preparation you can afford to make. Likewise, if your campaign is set in the 4th era, then anything outside of Skyrim is essentially open season, apart from the small snippets of information we get about the rest of the world through in-game books and dialogue. This is one of the reasons I set my campaign in the middle of Arena and Daggerfall. It minimizes the amount of new lore that I had to come up with whole cloth, and any disruption of the canon timeline that results from my players' actions can be conveniently hand-waved by the warp in the West. Once you figure out the setting and timeline, the next step is to just plan out the campaign like you would any other. There's tons of videos and articles covering this kind of thing, but for my part, I'll just advise you to start simple. Pick a city, town, or some other location that sounds interesting and build out from there. The best part of using the Elder Scrolls as a setting is that you don't need to improvise as much when your players go off the rails. Especially if it's a part of the world that's been featured in one of the TES games, you can just look up a map and pick a location in that direction. Hell, if you're really lazy, you can just rip the enemy's treasure chests and quest hooks straight from the games. If your players have only ever played Skyrim before, then how are they going to know if you lift an entire dungeon from Oblivion or Morrowind? You might want to be careful about grabbing dungeons from Arena or Daggerfall, though. I used maps from the Elder Scrolls Arena for several important locations in my campaign, and my players definitely noticed the difference. Arena's maps are labyrinthine and confusing to navigate. Even the main quest dungeons are a chaotic mess of fractal hallways, secret doors, winding waterways, and easy-to-miss switchbacks. Even though I restocked the dungeon with my own traps, puzzles, monsters, and treasure, just using the floor plan of the original dungeon made exploring these locations a bit of a slog. After repeated complaints, I started rearranging the original maps to flow more logically, and I had them just stick to the first floor. If your party really likes dungeon crawling, then this might not be as much of an issue for you, but if they don't like to spend a lot of time indoors fighting monsters, then you might want to avoid using these maps. One other thing I'd like to touch on is cosmology. As the DMG mentions, there are certain spells and effects in Dungeons & Dragons that rely on there being other planes of existence that players can access in some way. For the most part, the Great Wheel of D&D is fairly compatible with the Orbis of the Elder Scrolls universe. The Mundus is the prime material plane, of course. Aetherius is essentially a combination of the astral plane of D&D and the upper planes where the gods reside. The Realm of Oblivion is basically everything else. The lower planes, the ethereal plane, the elemental chaos, and the Shadowfell. The Feywild could either be an Aetherius or Oblivion, or could either be other worlds of the Mundus or unexplored regions of Nirn. The only thing that gets kind of tricky is a spell like Summon Celestial or Divination, where you're assumed to be speaking with the gods or summoning their servants. In the Elder Scrolls universe, it's a pretty big deal theologically that the 8-in-1 divines are distant and inscrutable. Much like gods in the real world, priests of the Imperial Temple have to mostly rely on faith, seeing elements of the world as manifestations of their gods, and interpreting signs and omens as messages from the divines. So if your players are able to just cast a second-level spell and get a direct line to Akatosh, that kind of breaks a key aspect of the cosmology. As a result, I usually rule that spells like this either contact non-malevolent Daedra or else some other divine being like the Magna Gi. The Elder Scrolls Online does have creatures called Celestials that are apparently manifestations of the stars that were created through magic by ancient humans. So if you're not against using stuff from ESO in your game, this is also a possibility. If all else fails, you can simply have your players agree not to learn or cast these spells, or just have them connect to a vague, undefined source of knowledge. As for spells like Plane Shift and Banishment, which actually send people to other planes of existence, well, there's not much material here to go on. Most of the Elder Scrolls series is focused on Nirn in general, and the continent of Tamriel in particular. We have very little information to work with for most of the realms of Oblivion, and next to nothing about Aetherius, other than a few very brief trips to isolated sections of it. Most of the realms of Oblivion that are ruled over by a Daedric prince have been given little more than a brief description in the lore, while for the rest of it, we're lucky if we even get that much. Many of these planes have been featured in ESO, if you consider those appearances canon, but otherwise you're mostly limited to the Deadlands of Mehrunes Dagon, Hermaeus Mora's realm of Apocrypha, Sheogorath's Shivering Isles, and a small section of one of Sanguine's myriad realms of Revelry. Of these, only the Shivering Isles are really explored in any depth. The rest are only small snippets of what are implied to be much larger or perhaps even infinite planes of existence. Overall, other planes of existence in the Elder Scrolls are much like they are in the current edition of D&D. If you want to set an adventure there, all you've really got to work with for the most part is the basic overview of what the place is like, and you have to make up all the details yourself, at least until they release Planescape. On the plus side, there are essentially no rules when it comes to Oblivion. It's like D&D's Abyss, a realm of raw chaos that the strongest of demons can bend to their will, so basically anything you want to include would make sense in this context. Hell, you can even slip in things from Ravenloft or one of the MTG settings in here if you want to. It's entirely up to you at this point, so just let your creativity run wild and see where it takes you. Well, that's the end of part 3. And also the last of this little mini-series on how to turn D&D into the Elder Scrolls. Thanks so much for watching. Was any of this helpful? Is there anything that I didn't talk about that you want to see in a future video? Have you run your own Elder Scrolls campaign? Did you use similar methods to mine, or do you have your own advice you'd like to share? If so, leave a comment, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell if you want to see more stuff from me. If you like this kind of content, let me know in the comments what else you'd like to see me work on. Final Fantasy, Fallout, Assassin's Creed, Pokemon, whatever. It doesn't even have to be an RPG. I have a survival horror adventure based loosely on things like Resident Evil and Silent Hill that I've run a few times. If you're interested in hearing about that, I'm also open to any suggestions you have about other kinds of content you'd like to see. Finally, I have a player's guide PDF containing most of the stuff that I've talked about in this video that I passed out to my players. I also have a couple of pre-written dungeons and other materials that might be useful if you're thinking of running a TES campaign. I was going to make a Patreon and host it on there, but it occurred to me that might not be exactly legal. So if anyone with more experience in this kind of thing has any ideas on how I could make something like that available to anyone who wants to see it, you can leave a comment or contact me via my social media links in the description. Well, that's it. Good night and good gaming.